and today I'll be presenting on some of the works I did during my PhD. Before I get into my research, I would like to share with you some of my background. I was born and raised in Malaysia, and when I was 19, in 2005, I went to New Zealand for my undergrad studies. And after that, I furthered my studies another 4 years to obtain a PhD in chemistry. So before I really get into my research, I would like to share a few special points with you about New Zealand. I spent there about 8 years. Okay, so when I was in New Zealand, I spent most of my time in Wellington, which is the center. It is the capital city of New Zealand. So one of the special points about New Zealand, I think we are all quite familiar with it. New Zealand is a huge producer of dairy products, and is quite famous around the world. New Zealand is famous for its milk, cheese, yogurt, things like that. And then I think we also know that New Zealand is quite famous for the kiwi fruit. And there's another thing that in New Zealand they are also called kiwi. New Zealanders call themselves kiwi as well. So another special characteristic about New Zealand is about its tourism industry. New Zealand is a very beautiful country with very amazing landscapes. It is very suitable for outdoor activities such as hiking, or if you like some more extreme sports, you can try the bungee jumping or whitewater rafting, something like that. And then due to its very beautiful landscape, it's also been selected as the site to shoot many of the big productions, such as The Lord of the Rings and also The Hobbit. And further than that, the sites that have been used for the movie shootings have also become favorite spots for tourists, such as the Hobbiton, and then also the Weta Workshop. The studio that made these movies is also based in Wellington. And apart from that, New Zealand is also quite famous for the education. It has quite a few universities that provide very high quality education for both domestic students and international students. I just like to, when I was there, I was based in the School of Chemical and Physical Sciences of Victoria University. I just like to mention here that one of my closest friends there is Fatiha. We met there, and yeah, so it's great that we are working in the same place again here. So I did my undergrad studies with the School of Chemical and Physical Sciences, and then I did my PhD with the Diamond Institute under the Diamond Institute for Advanced Materials and Nanotechnology. So next I would like to talk a little bit about the Diamond Institute. So the Diamond Institute is one of the biggest research institutes in New Zealand. It's made up of a large network of leading scientists. The focus of, actually the name of Diamond also has some background. The institute was named after Alan McDiamond, which some of you may know. He was a recipient of Nobel Prize in Chemistry. So for the McDiamond Institute, the focus of the research is on the material science and also nanotechnology. Some of the main topics include nanofabrication and devices, electronic and optical materials, molecular materials, bio-nano and soft matter. So I'm glad that I have the background with the McDiamond Institute. I think I'm also quite pleased while I'm here to establish some good collaboration between, for example, UTM or Inusina Institute with the McDiamond Institute. So within the McDiamond Institute, I was working with PhD, I was working under the supervision of Associate Professor Richard Tilly. I think Fatiha also. So in our research group, our focus was on the preparation and characterization of nanoparticles. We have access to a very good TEM, which is the background, that allows us to study in detail the fine structure and morphology of various types of nanoparticles. So in our research group, we are primarily interested to study nanoparticles that are below 100 nanometer in size. That's because in this length scale, that's where the unique properties of nanoparticles are most prominent. So for example, one of the unique properties of nanoparticles, for example, magnetic materials, is the superparamagnetism, fluorescence of quantum dots, and also the absorption or surface properties of metallic nanoparticles. Nanoparticles have many potential applications. For example, magnetic nanoparticles can be used for magnetic separation or drug delivery. Fluorescent quantum dots can be used for bioimaging or used as the light harvesting component in solar cells. And metallic nanoparticles can be used for catalysis and sensors applications. So in terms of my own research, my focus was to combine two types of materials in a single structure to obtain a bifunctional structure. For example, magnetic nanoparticles are magnetic and quantum dot, they are fluorescent. So when combined together, potentially we can get a bifunctional magnetic fluorescent structure. That was the goal of my research. So when in combination, this composite can be a starting point for a potential drug carrier. So things that we can add to these bifunctional structures include surface coatings such as polymer, targeting ligands, and the chemical drugs. So coming back to my research, my goal was really to prepare a composite that have good magnetic and fluorescent properties, and also to explore interesting structures that can arise when we combine two materials together. So in the literature, the types of magnetic materials that have been studied before include iron oxide, cobalt platinum, and iron platinum. And in terms of fluorescent material, the types of materials that have been studied before include cadmium selenide and cadmium sulfide. So for my own research, I have selected the magnetic component. I've selected nickel as a magnetic component due to its strong magnetic properties, and also cadmium selenide as the fluorescent component because of its strong fluorescent intensity. So now I will go into the methodology, and the first part involves the preparation of these bifunctional nanostructures. Essentially, it's a two-step process. The preparation is usually carried out in a 3-neck flask under nitrogen atmosphere. So the first step is the preparation of the magnetic component, which is nickel nanoparticles. It's prepared by the thermal decomposition of nickel acetate in olefin. And the second step is to form the fluorescent cadmium selenide shell on the surface of the nickel seeds. And that was achieved by the injection of cadmium and selenium precursors into the reaction mixture. So in my research, I studied a number of parameters, including types of precursors, types of surfactants, solvents, concentration, and temperature. In terms of characterization, the size, shape, elemental composition, and crystal structure of the samples was studied by the TEM. Absorption properties and fluorescent properties were studied by UV spectroscopy, and finally, the magnetic strength of the samples was studied by the superconducting quantum interference device. Okay, so now I will go into some of the results. So the first step of the preparation of the composite is to prepare the nickel nanoparticles. So during my research, I was able to prepare 5 types of nickel particles with different size, different composition, and different shape. So as you can see from the TEM image on the right hand side, so the first one is spherical nickel nanoparticles of about 40 nanometer in size, and then nickel carbide about 40 nanometer in size, and smaller size nickel particles of about 20 nanometer in size, and even smaller at 10 nanometer, and also cube shape nickel nanoparticles. So next I would like to go into a bit detail on the thermal decomposition process for preparation of nanoparticles. So essentially, the thermal decomposition process involves first dissolving the nickel precursor in a suitable solvent. In this case, it's the olefin. And then when it's heated at high temperature, the nickel precursor will be decomposed, releasing the nickel 2+ cations. And then in the presence of a mild reducing agent, in this case is olefin, the nickel 2+ cations can be reduced to elemental nickel. And then once the concentration of the nickel atoms reach a critical concentration, they will nucleate and grow into nanoparticles. And the way to control the size or other characteristic of the nanoparticles lies in the various experimental conditions. So as we can see from here, in the variation of the different experimental conditions, we can in some ways control the size, shape, and composition of the resultant nickel-based nanoparticles. In a typical reaction to prepare 40 nanometer nickel nanoparticles, nickel acetate was dissolved in olefin and heated at 240 degrees for about 30 minutes. And in the presence, when we add a small amount of octadecene, we get nickel carbide instead. That's because octadecene can react with nickel to form nickel carbide. And to prepare nickel nanoparticles of smaller size, there are a couple of strategies that we can apply. One of them, to prepare the 20 nanometer nickel, is to use surface capping agent. In this case, it's the trioctylphosphine. Trioctylphosphine can bind strongly to the surface of nickel. That is the reason why it can help to slow down the rate of growth of the nickel nanoparticles. That's why we are able to, it's possible to get particles of smaller size by using a strong surface binding agent. And another strategy to obtain smaller particle size is by reducing the reaction time. In this case, when I reduce the reaction time from 30 minutes to 5 minutes, I was able to prepare nickel nanoparticles of about 10 nanometer in size. And finally, to prepare the nickel nanocubes actually involve a very special combination of reaction conditions that was developed not by me but by one of my colleagues in the same research group. Basically, the special ingredient here was the hydrogen gas, and then the preparation in a pressure vessel, and in order to produce such kind of cube-shaped nickel nanoparticles, which are quite special. So once I have successfully prepared all the different kinds of nickel seeds, I moved on to study the coating of these nickel seeds with cadmium selenide and the chemistry behind it. So, as I have mentioned before, the preparation of these bifunctional structures is essentially a two-step process. First one is the preparation of nickel nanoparticles, and then the second step involves the injection of the cadmium and selenium precursor solutions. Actual experiments carried out in the lab shows that this two-step process only applicable for 3 cases, which are the 40 nanometer nickel cores, 40 nanometer nickel carbide, and for the 10 nanometer nickel cores. What happened to the other 2 cases, the 20 nanometer one and the nickel nanocubes, is this. So what happens is that the cadmium selenide actually not coating the nickel, it just forms separate clusters. This is because in the reaction mixture, if you remember previously when I discussed on the preparation of nickel, to prepare the 20 nanometer nickel, I need to use the surface capping agent, which is the trioctylphosphine. Trioctylphosphine binds strongly to the surface of nickel. At the same time, it also blocks the excess of cadmium and selenium. That's why cadmium selenide cannot form on the surface of nickel. On the other hand, it only forms separate clusters. So how to overcome this problem? At that time, I remember I tried quite a number of things, and one of the things that worked well was to add 2 more steps to the preparation process. So one of them is the washing of nickel nanoparticles with toluene and ethanol to remove the excess trioctylphosphine and to redisperse the nickel nanoparticles in fresh ola amine before the injection of cadmium and selenium precursor. When these 2 extra steps were applied, these 3 types of nickel particles could be coated with cadmium selenide successfully. So let's take a closer look at the morphology of the cadmium selenide shell. We can see that in some cases there are some similarities, and then in some cases the morphology of the cadmium selenide shell is quite different. So for example, 40 nanometer nickel, 20 nanometer nickel, and nickel nanocubes, they have very similar morphology on the cadmium selenide shell. Essentially, the nickel particles, they are covered with small particles of cadmium selenide, which are about 5 nanometer in size. What about the other cases? For the nickel carbide, it is a quite different scenario. If you look closely, you find that most of the cadmium selenide domains, they are plate-like. They are not like spherical particles like the other cases, but they are plate-like particles, which is quite interesting. And for the 10 nanometer nickel cores, it's also very different morphology for cadmium selenide. Essentially, the cadmium selenide domain grow into a very large, much larger size, up to 20 nanometer, and it fully encapsulates the nickel seeds. So next, the question is, why are we seeing these kind of similarities, and why we are seeing something different in some of the cases? So part of my PhD research was try to explain this and then try to understand what is going on. So next is my understanding of what is going on, and I hope that it makes sense to you too. So next, first we look at the effect of nickel size first, comparing 40, 20, and 10 nanometer. So when we try to consider why such kind of structures form, the the kind of idea we came up with is that the structures that forms are actually very closely related to the crystal structure of the materials that are used. For example, nickel is made up of face-centered cubic crystal structure, and then cadmium selenide is mainly form the hexagonal woodside structure. These two structures, they are very different from each other. So when these two materials are in close contact, we can imagine that the strain energy at the interface will be very high and make it not favorable to have the interface. So to go into a bit more detail on that, we can have a look at these two diagrams. So for example, the first pair of material, they are a pair of materials with very similar crystal structures. And when the crystal structure very similar, most of the time they will have very small lattice mismatch. So that means they fit very well at the interface. And when they fit well at the interface, there is not a lot of strain at the interface. So the formation of this interface, we can say that is favorable. But when we have two materials that have very different crystal structure, we find that they don't fit very well at all at the interface. And then in order for the interface to form, somehow one of them needs to be compressed in some way, or the other one needs to be stretched in some ways. And then when that happens, a lot of strain is arise at the interface. If we look at this example here, which we have nickel on the left and the cadmium selenide on the right hand side. So in this case, the estimated lattice mismatch is about 71%. So when we have such high mismatch between these two materials, we can imagine that the formation of the interface is probably not very favorable. So when this happens, two things tend to take place. One is that the cadmium selenide will try to minimize the contact with nickel in order to minimize the strain. That's one of the things. And then the other one is that the size of cadmium selenide will be limited to small size, because the greater size it grows into, the more strain there will be at the interface. So that's kind of an idea that helps to explain why we are seeing the structures on the 40 nanometer size and 20 nanometer size particles. So we can see that first the contact area between cadmium selenide and nickel is small, and also the size of the nickel nanoparticles is small. But how can we explain what happens for the 10 nanometer nickel seeds? Essentially what happens is when the nickel size is very small, it tends to have very low crystallinity and very high surface energy. When the surface energy is very high, that means that the surface arrangement of atoms is also very highly disordered. So we can consider that cadmium selenide is essentially growing on nickel as if it is an amorphous material. So lattice mismatch, we expect not play a very strong role here at all. That's why cadmium selenide, one can grow into a very large size domain, and two, it fully encapsulates the surface of the nickel cores. And then it's quite similar case for the cube-shaped nanoparticles. It's also due to the large lattice mismatch that in the same case, the cadmium selenide domains grow onto nickel with small contact area as well as small size. So So next, another interesting comparison will be a comparison between nickel and nickel carbide. So as we have discussed before, for nickel, due to the large mismatch between the crystal structure, nickel, face center cubic nickel, and the hexagonal woodside, we tend to get cadmium selenide that have small contact area with nickel as well as small size. But what happens for the nickel carbide is kind of opposite, because what we are seeing is that one, the cadmium selenide grow into very large size domain, much larger, and also it tend to have much higher contact area with the nickel carbide. So this we think is also closely related to the crystal structure. So when we compare the crystal structure between nickel carbide and woodside, just by looking at the unit cell, we can see that it has very similar. It's very similar. Nickel carbide is rhombohedral crystal structure, and woodside is hexagonal. So we can expect that at the interface they can fit well together with little strain. That's why it's possible, one, for cadmium selenide to grow into a large domain and to have a large area of contact between the two materials. Finally, I would like to talk a little bit about the optical properties and magnetic properties of the bifunctional structures. So we didn't really get into too much detail on this, just on the basic. For the absorption, when we compare before coating and after coating, essentially there is not much effect. But when we look at the photoluminescence, fluorescence properties, it's clear that once the nickel nanoparticles have been coated, fluorescence have been detected. Fluorescence of cadmium selenide have been detected in the sample. Another thing that we notice is also we find there's a relationship between the particle size of cadmium selenide with the emission maximum of the fluorescence. So as the particle size increase, the emission wavelength is also shift to longer wavelength. So this is in agreement with the quantum confinement theory. So when we come to the magnetic properties, what we are really interested is the region at the back here. So the region at the back here is really a measure of the magnetic strength of the material. So the black line is for the uncoated nickel, and then the red line is for the coated nickel. So what we are seeing is that the magnetic strength decrease after coating with cadmium selenide. So this is quite understandable, and it's also been reported in previous works. That is because once the nickel particles have been coated with cadmium selenide, the overall magnetic content in the sample has also decreased. That's why we see an overall decrease of magnetic strength. And we also see a trend of the decrease of magnetic strength with the decrease of nickel nanoparticle size. So two things that we are seeing here, which is quite general, as we decrease the particle size of nickel itself, the magnetization value of nickel also decreases. And for all cases, once we have added on the cadmium selenide coating, the overall magnetization also decreases, and the decrease is much higher for smaller size nickel. So just like to relate a bit to the previous literature. So based on the program. So with the composites I have prepared, I was able to reach the highest value of magnetization of about 32.7 EMU per gram. So in conclusion, the findings in my work have helped me to further my knowledge and understanding in the methods, firstly the methods for preparation of nickel and nickel-cadmium selenide bifunctional nanostructures, and second, for further understanding on the factors governing the growth behavior of the cadmium selenide shell layer, and finally to have more understanding on what affects the fluorescent and magnetic properties of these bifunctional structures. So finally, I would like to thank specifically for my research during my PhD, my supervisor, Associate Professor Richard Tilly, my group members, the research group, Tilly Research Group, and David Flynn, who was a great help. I think Fatiha for him. David Flynn, who was our TEM technician. And for academic staff, all academic staff and all the academics and staff of School of Chemical and Physical Sciences of Victoria University, and also great appreciation for Diamond Institute for funding my PhD. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Lisa, for her presentation. Now I want to invite questions from the floor. Okay. Questions or comments for our Dr. Sia? Yes, please.
I just know about the caution. How stable is your caution? Do you do any stability tests?
You mean stability test in terms of thermal stability? So in terms of thermal stability, from the different temperatures I have tested before, they can be stable up to about 280 degrees. But when it reaches about 300 degrees, basically it will degrade into another material. In some cases, I find that the nickel can react with selenium to form nickel selenide, which reduces the magnetic properties of nickel. And in terms of solvent, it's very stable in organic solvents, but not very dispersible in aqueous conditions. I also have not had a chance to study the stability, for example, in acidic condition or alkaline conditions.
It's on the nanotube, the nanotubes and the sphere nanoparticles. Which one is giving more fluorescence properties? I did not see the
So I studied two things in terms of the fluorescence. First, I studied where is the wavelength of the fluorescence, and then the second thing I studied was on the fluorescence intensity. So that's measured in terms of the quantum U. So I haven't really shown the result here clearly. Essentially, the quantum U is not very high. In my case, is estimated to be around 1 to 2%, and then actually the size, the domain size of the nickel, it seems like in this case there's not much effect on the quantum U. Yeah.
I mean, we have this sphere and
Yeah.
then nanotubes.
Yeah.
Which one having more higher quantum U?
They are essentially very similar.
So
Yeah.
no effect on the shape as well.
Yeah. Based on my findings, yes.
Can you show me the tables that give us the condition, the parameters, and also
For the preparation of nickel.
it's on this one. During the thermal decomposition, I believe there is a reduction of nickel to plus nickel zero.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, which one is acting as a reducing agent?
Based on our understanding and also report from previous work, is the reducing agent in this case is the OLAMine.
So when you do not have OLAMine, like basically,
Ah.
the reducing agent is coming from hydrogen.
Yes, that's our understanding.
So the reason why you have different types of the shape is because of the effect of the reducing agent.
Based on the work that has been done by my colleague, he's kind of come to the idea that the hydrogen gas has two functions. One is acting as a reducing agent. Two is that it binds to the 100 surface of the nickel crystal. That's why the growth on those facets are stunted. That's why the growth is more on the 111 facets. That's why it can grow into cube shape. There's a preference interaction between the hydrogen gas and on the 100 facets of nickel. Yeah.
So the reason why it takes much longer time than the clinical one is
Longer time, you mean in terms of reaction time?
yes, it's very long.
You mean for the cubes?
Yes.
So, for me, it's like because not kind of not my research, so I don't not 100% understanding, but based on my understanding, one reason for the long reaction time is the low reaction temperature, so it needs longer time to fully decompose of the nickel precursors. And then the second reason for that, based on my understanding, is that the growth of these particles, actually they grow better when they grow slowly. Yeah, when the growth is too fast, there's a preference to form the most stable shape, which is the spherical shape. So when the growth is very, very slow, other things such as the hydrogen gas can have a more dominant effect on controlling the shape of the particles. Yes.
From the cadmium selenium wave type of cadmium selenium shell, why it can how to control that it can be developed only on the nickel particles?
You mean because I understand what you mean. So the cadmium selenide, it have two choices. It either grow on nickel or it grows by itself. So actually, in my case, based on my reactions, actually I find both happens. So I have the cadmium selenide that grow on the surface of nickel, as well as because the cadmium selenide amount that I use is always in excess. So there's always some that grow separately. So the more important point in this is how to separate the cadmium selenide that are not attached to the nickel. So what we can do here is actually quite helpful that nickel is magnetic, because we can use magnetic separation to separate the composite and then the cadmium selenide that are not attached.
So you already
Yeah.
collect them before you do the oral analysis.
Yes.
And one more question is on before the research school. I just missed out some of the slides before the research school. Can you show me one slide before the research school? I do not know what is this radio means.
To be honest, I take this from a review paper. I also not 100% 100% sure, but I think based on my understanding is, I think a kind of radioactive material.
So you add like the
Yeah, I think some radiation that arise from radioactive decay can be used for cancer treatment. Yeah, that's my understanding of
it's
yeah.
the magnetic thing.
Uh-huh.
I thought that you are
Uh-huh.
something that
Possibly it can be used as an imaging agent, and also actually magnetic material can also be used as an imaging agent. For example, MRI imaging is based on the use of magnetic materials, and things like such as iron oxide and iron nanoparticles have currently been established as the imaging agent for MRI imaging. Yes.
Okay, alright, you want the last question? Yes, please.
Can you show us the slide which where you made mention of the electron properties of the particles?
This one? This one?
No, the increment, the emission.
This one?
Yes, yes. You mentioned that the increment in the size is responsible for the increase in the emission properties. Can you expatiate on what is responsible at the electronic energy level as responsible for the increase in the emission?
Yeah, it's I'm not like 100% like expert in this, but based on my understanding from chemist's point of view and its relationship to nanoparticle properties, is that as the nanoparticle size increases, the fluorescence will the material will fluoresce at a higher wavelength. So this has been shown by many works on the quantum dots research. So one of the example is on the cadmium selenide. So when the particle size is changed from between 2.5 to 6.3, basically it has a direct relationship to the band gap, and this is quite unique to nanoparticles, and it only happens to nanoparticles. And then we can see that the fluorescence is also in different colors.